It was the kind of night that seemed to hush the town into submission. A low fog clung to the cobblestone streets, curling around the lampposts like it was hiding something. The air was damp enough to seep into your sleeves, and the only sound beyond the river was the rhythmic hum of the Hawthorne Gazette printing press, Herning out the next morning's paper. Inside the brick building at the end of Sycamore Street, the press floor smelled of ink and metal. Fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the machinery, every bolt and gear catching a cold glint. Edward Langley was there, somewhere beyond the clatter of the rollers, the kind of man who thrived in these hours when most of the town was asleep. He had been running the Gazette for nearly 20 years, never missing a deadline, never letting the press run without him watching. That night, though, the machine faltered, the steady thump slowed, then stuttered. Somewhere in the building, a metallic clank echoed, sharp and out of place. The press crew glanced at each other, uneasy. One of them stepped toward the office door at the far end of the floor. It was ajar, the light inside flickering faintly. Langley wasn't there. His chair sat pushed back from the desk, a coffee mug still steaming beside a pile of proof sheets. The door to the alley was locked from the inside. Outside, the street was empty, fog swallowing every shape beyond a few feet. By morning, the police would be called. By the end of the week, the town would know he was gone. But in this moment, on this damp, silent night, the last anyone saw of Edward Langley was somewhere between the roll of fresh newsprint and the hiss of the press that would never finish its run. Edward Langley was not the sort of man who blended into the background. At 6'2", with a frame made lean from years of pacing newsrooms, he had a presence that seemed to fill the space before he even spoke. His hair, once black, had turned a salt-and-pepper shade that matched the faint stubble he rarely bothered to shave on deadline weeks. People in town knew him for his dry wit, his slow, deliberate way of speaking, and the constant aroma of coffee and ink that seemed to cling to his CL. He had taken over the Hawthorne Gazette in his early 30s, inheriting a paper that had been teetering on the edge of irrelevance. Under his watch, it became the pulse of the town, covering everything from local council disputes to the high school football championships. He believed in showing up at every town hall meeting, even when the chairs were half empty, and walking the streets with a battered leather notebook in his pocket. More than one shop owner had looked up to find him quietly jotting something down, eyes narrowed in thought, before offering a polite nod and moving on. And outside the newsroom, Langley's life was unremarkable in the way that made him seem steady, almost untouchable. He lived in a small, 2-story house on the edge of town, where the porch light burned long after midnight. Neighbors often saw him in the early hours, sitting at the kitchen table with the blinds open, a stack of papers spread before him. He never married, though there had been a few quiet romances over the years, relationships that ended without public drama, as if both sides had agreed to keep their privacy intact. He had habits people found endearing, the way he'd hum old jazz tunes under his breath while editing copy, or how he'd stop mid-sentence to draw a sketch in the margins of his notepad. His desk was a controlled chaos of photographs, paper clippings, and fountain pens. But among the clutter there were certain items he guarded more carefully, a small wooden box kept in the top drawer and a worn envelope that he never left unattended. In the weeks before his disappearance, some of the staff noticed subtle changes. He lingered less in conversation, his laughter came slower, and he spent more time behind his office door than on the floor with the reporters. There were moments when he'd stand at the window overlooking Sycamore Street, lost in thought, the pen in his hand tapping lightly against the glass. When asked what was on his mind, he'd smile faintly and say, "Just making sure I get the truth right, that's all." What no one knew then was how those late nights and that guarded envelope would cast a shadow far longer than anyone in the newsroom could have imagined. The first signs were so slight they could have been dismissed as the strain of too many deadlines. Edward Langley had always been particularly careful with his words, slow to anger, but that autumn there was a new edge to him, something taut beneath the surface. He would arrive earlier than anyone else, long before the sun lifted the frost from the sidewalks, and yet leave long after the streetlights had blinked. His office door, once habitually left open so staff could drift in and out, now stayed shut. One evening, a junior reporter named Mark Hensley walked past and heard Langley speaking in a low voice, not the brisk, precise tone he used in Interv. Use but something softer, almost hesitant. Mark assumed he was on the phone, but when he glanced through the crack in the blinds, he saw no receiver in Langley's hand, only that worn envelope on the desk, and his fingers pressed flat against it, as if weighing it down. Others began to notice different things. He started carrying his leather notebook everywhere, even into the press room, something he had never done before. At lunch, instead of joining the staff at the diner across the street, he would take a slow walk around the block, eyes scanning the rooftops, eyes the people. A delivery driver swore he saw Langley slip an unmarked manila folder into the hands of a stranger by the bus station one rainy afternoon. When asked about it later, Langley simply said, "Old friend," and changed the subject. The most unsettling moment came during a late production night. The staff was putting the final touches on the Sunday edition when the lights flickered in the building. A few of the crew joked about the wiring, but Langley's face had gone pale. He stepped to the back window, staring into the dark alley behind the Gazette, and stood there so long that one of the press operators asked if something was wrong. His answer was strange, clipped, and out of character. "Some stories you don't get to tell twice." No one knew exactly what he meant. But in hindsight, those small, sharp edges in his behavior, the guarded conversations, the uncharacteristic secrecy, the way he seemed to listen for things no one else could hear, were the cracks in the surface. Cracks that hinted at something large pressing against the walls of his life, looking for a way in. And maybe, already, a man like Edward Langley knew it was only a matter of time before it did. October 12, 1984 was a Friday, a night when most of the town was already leaning into the weekend. The Gazette's press room smelled of fresh ink, the air thick and warm from the machines. Outside, the fog was rolling in again, draping Sycamore Street in a pale curtain. The clock above the main door read 9:17 p.m. When Edward Langley was last seen by anyone in the building, Mark Hensley had passed by his office, carrying a stack of proof sheets. Langley was seated at his desk, leaning forward, reading something intently. The light from his desk lamp cast his face into sharp relief, shadowing the deep lines around his mouth. Mark remembered that Langley looked up just long enough to nod before returning to the page in front of him. At 9:26, the press stuttered. A heavy metallic snap rang out, followed by the slow groan of the rollers winding down. The sound drew two press operators from the floor toward the source of the problem. The machine had stopped mid-feed, half of a front page was caught in the rollers. The headline was visible but incomplete, letters breaking off into nothing. Someone called for Langley, no answer. The crew spread out, first checking the washroom, then the storage rooms, then the loading bay. His coat still hung on the stand by the door. His wallet, keys, and glasses lay neatly on the desk beside that same worn envelope. A coffee mug sat beside it, still faintly warm. The building's rear door was locked from the inside. The front door had been closed all evening, and no one had heard it open. Outside, the street was empty, just the thickening fog and the faint glow of a street lamp swaying in the breeze. The only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock, marking seconds that now felt heavier than hours. By 9:45, the search had widened to the sidewalk and alley. A delivery truck rumbled past, its headlights sweeping the walls, revealing nothing but wet brick and garbage bins. Mark swore he caught a faint rustling in the shadows, but when he stepped closer, there was only the steady drip of water from the fire escape. It was as if Langley had slipped between one breath and the next, leaving only the press frozen mid-print, a machine that would never finish its run. A room that suddenly felt far too big without him in it. The first hours were frantic. By 10 o'clock that night, the Gazette's newsroom had turned into a command post. Phones rang without pause. The pressroom crew, still in their ink-stained aprons, paced between desks. Mark Hensley called the police, his voice tight and clipped as he relayed the facts. Last seen less than 30 minutes ago, no sign of leaving the Buey. Elding, personal belongings untouched. Within the hour, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside, their headlights cutting through the fog. Sergeant Paul Whitaker, a stocky man with a steady voice, took charge. He ordered a room-by-room search of the Gazette building. Officers checked every closet, storage space, and utility shaft. Even the crawlspace beneath the press floor was inspected, but it yielded nothing more than dust and old wiring. By midnight, volunteers had joined the effort. Some were reporters from rival papers, others were shop owners and residents who had heard the news on the police radio. They combed the sidewalks, shining flashlights into alleys and behind dumpsters. A search party moved toward the riverbank, their boots crunching on gravel, scanning for any trace of movement along the dark water. The fog made the search almost impossible. From more than 10 feet away, a flashlight beam dissolved into white haze. Sound carried strangely too, footsteps echoed as if they came from different directions, and the low hum of the press, now shut off, seemed to linger in the ears. Inside the newsroom, a young officer named Claire Morton sifted through Langley's desk. She found neatly stacked proof sheets, an untouched sandwich in wax paper, and a calendar with several dates circled in red. There were no notes explaining why. When she opened the top drawer, she found the small wooden box the staff had mentioned before. It was locked. At 2:00 a.m., a K-9 unit arrived. The dogs sniffed around the pressroom, the office, and the loading dock. They followed Langley's scent to the front door, but it stopped abruptly as if it had been cut off mid-step. The dogs paced in circles, confused, before returning to sit by the entrance. By dawn, the official line was that there was no evidence of foul play at this stage. But to those who had been there that night, that meant nothing. They knew the man was gone. They had seen the chair left half-swiveled from the desk, the coffee cooling beside an unfinished headline, the sense palpable and heavy that whatever had happened to Edward Langley had happened fast, too fast for anyone to stop it. In the weeks that followed, the investigation began to lose its shape. Leads that had once seemed promising dissolved into nothing, leaving only fragments of speculation behind. The police interviewed every member of the Gazette staff twice, then 3 times, but the accounts never changed. Langley had been in his office. The P.R.S. had jammed, and when they went to fetch him, he was gone. No one had heard a shout, a struggle, or even footsteps leaving the building. There were whispers about a man seen near the bus station that night, carrying a leather bag similar to Langley's. But when detectives tracked down the witness, he admitted he had only glimpsed the figure through the fog and could not be certain it was him. Another tip claimed Langley had been spotted boarding a late-night freight train headed south, yet the station logs showed no such departure. Inside the Gazette, the mood soured. The newsroom, once full of chatter and the clack of typewriters, grew quiet. Reporters worked with an unspoken heaviness, their eyes drawn again and again to the empty office with its blinds half closed. Mark Hensley, who had been the last to see him, stopped talking to the press altogether. He seemed to shrink into himself, his work piling up untouched. The town's patience began to wear thin. Some said Langley had simply walked away, that the stress had finally pushed him to abandon everything. Others believed he had been silenced for something he was about to publish. Theories multiplied, each more far-fetched than the last, but none carried proof. By late November, the search had been scaled back. The police still took calls about possible sightings, but the urgency was gone. Sergeant Whitaker admitted privately to a colleague that without new evidence, they had reached the end of the road. He hated the feeling, like staring at a locked door with no key, knowing something important lay just beyond it. For the people who had spent those first frantic nights scouring the town, the letdown was bitter. They had seen the coffee cup on the desk, the coat still on the hook, the half-printed newspaper hanging in the press like a photograph frozen in time. To stop looking felt like admitting defeat. And yet, as winter settled over Hawthorne, the truth was unavoidable. Edward Langley had vanished without leaving so much as a thread to pull. It was nearly 2 decades later when the Gazette building, long abandoned and sagging under years of neglect, was slated for demolition. The windows were boarded up, the roof had bowed inward in places, and ivy crawled up the brick like it was trying to pull the whole structure back in. The ground, most of the town had stopped thinking about Edward Langley by then, at least out loud. But on the morning the demolition crew arrived, his name was spoken again. Tom Weaver, the site foreman, was walking the crew through the main floor when one of the men noticed something odd. The press room, though coated in dust, still held the old printing press. Its hulking frame stood like a monument in the center of the room. But it wasn't empty. A single sheet of newsprint was still caught in the rollers, half-printed, yellowed with age. It was as if the machine had been frozen mid-breath since that night in 1984. Weaver, curious, stepped closer. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words that were visible stopped him cold. The headline stretched across the top in thick black letters, but it broke off halfway through, ending in jagged ink where the press had stopped. Beneath it was the faint outline of a photograph, too blurred with time to make out clearly. Words spread quickly. By mid-afternoon, a few townspeople had gathered outside the chain-link fence, craning their necks to see inside. Among them was Mark Hensley, now grayer and slower, who hadn't set foot in the building since the week after Langley vanished. He stared at the press for a long time, his jaw tight, before asking Weaver if the page could be removed without tearing. As the crew worked carefully to free the brittle sheet from the machine, a strange hush fell over the room. The clatter of tools outside seemed distant, even the sound of the wind rattling the loose boards faded. Everyone watched as the paper came loose, revealing words no one expected to read again. Whatever it said, it was enough to make Weaver glance at Hensley with a look that was part disbelief, part unease. Hensley didn't speak. He simply folded the page in half and slid it into his coat pocket, his fingers pressing it flat the same way Langley once had. That worn envelope. The demolition halted for the day. Something about that sheet of newsprint, pulled from the machine after all those years, felt heavier than paper should. And for the first time in a long while, people in Hawthorne began to wonder if the story Edward Langley had been chasing had never really gone away at all. That night, the small kitchen of Mark Hensley's house was lit only by the glow of the single bulb over the table. The folded sheet of newsprint lay in front of him, untouched since he'd slipped it from the press. His dinner sat cold on the counter. He had poured himself a glass of whiskey, but hadn't taken more than one sip. For a long time he just stared at the paper, his fingertips resting lightly on its surface, as if afraid that pressing too hard would turn it to dust. Finally he unfolded it. The headline, now fully visible in the dim light, was more unsettling than he had imagined: Council members' secret meeting linked to missing funds. And below it, half-blurred but still recognizable, was a photograph of 3 men standing outside what looked like the back door of a restaurant. One of them was Edward Langley. The other 2, Mark knew their faces immediately. He sat back, his chair creaking, the old wood groaning beneath him. His heart had started to pound in that deep, uncomfortable way it does when the past suddenly stands in the same room as you. One of the men was still alive, still here in Hawthorne. A gust of wind rattled the kitchen window and Mark startled, his hand brushing the glass. It wasn't fear exactly, more the sudden understanding that whatever Langley had been chasing, someone had made sure it stayed buried. He folded the paper again, slower this time, and slid it into a large manila envelope. Then he stood, crossed the room, and locked the front door. The whiskey glass remained on the table untouched. Later, as he turned out the light and the kitchen sank into darkness, he found himself thinking about the look on Langley's face in that photograph. No. Triumphant, not scared, but almost as if he knew the picture would never see the front page. 2 days later, the rain came back, turning the streets of Hawthorne into slow-moving rivers of brown water. Mark drove with the wipers on high, the sound of rubber scraping glass keeping him company. In the passenger seat was the envelope, sealed now, with a single name written across the front in block letters: Rachel Kincaid. He hadn't spoken to Rachel in years. She used to run the local history archive before budget cuts closed it down, and she'd taken a quieter job at the county records office. If anyone still had the patience and the courage to piece together what Langley had been working on, it was her. When he pulled up outside the records building, he left the engine running, staring through the wet windshield. The place looked tired, the paint on the trim flaking away, the flag out front hanging limp in the damp air. For a moment he thought about just turning around, but then he remembered the photograph, Langley's half-smile, the other two men. And the way one of them had placed a hand on Langley's shoulder, not friendly, not threatening, but almost like a warning. Inside, the building smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Rachel was at her desk, glasses perched low on her nose, her hair pulled back the way she used to wear it when she was deep in research. She looked up when he stepped in, her expression changing from polite curiosity to something sharper. "Mark," she said, and it wasn't a question. He set the envelope on her desk. "I need you to see something," he told her, his voice low enough that the hum of the fluorescent lights nearly swallowed the words. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether she really wanted to be part of whatever this was. Then slowly she broke the seal. Rachel slid the photographs out first, her fingers pausing mid-motion as if the paper itself had grown heavier. She spread them on the desk, her eyes narrowing. Mark watched her trace a fingertip over Langley's face, then shift to the man standing beside him, the one with the sharp jaw and that unsettling half smile. "I've seen him before," she murmured, almost to herself. Mark leaned closer. Where? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the folded document at the bottom of the envelope. It was a photocopy, creased and slightly blurred, but the letterhead was unmistakable, an old Army Intelligence Division emblem from the late 70s. Rachel scanned the first few lines, then stopped, her gaze flicked up to him. "You have no idea what you've walked into, do you?" Mark stayed silent. The question felt rhetorical, and besides, he wasn't sure he wanted to admit how right she was. Rachel stood, moving to the tall file cabinet against the wall. The metal drawer squealed as she pulled it open, rifling through folders until she found one marked Incident Reports, classified/declassified Rick. SDS. She slid it onto the desk and began flipping. "Here," she said finally, turning the file toward him. There was another photograph, this one in black and white, dated 1981, the same man, same sharp jaw, same expression. Only this time he was in uniform, standing in front of a jeep marked with an unfamiliar unit insignia. Mark stared at it, a chill crawling up his spine. "That's 40 years ago," Rachel nodded slowly, "and yet he doesn't look any older now." Mark didn't speak, he couldn't. The photograph in front of him felt like a door opening into something far bigger than either of them had imagined, something that didn't fit neatly in. To any rational explanation, Rachel slid the folder shut and rested her hand on it, her expression unreadable. "Whatever this is," she said quietly, "it's not finished, and if you keep digging you'd better be ready for what you find." Outside, the wind rattled the thin window pane. Mark glanced toward it, as if half expecting to see that same sharp-jawed face staring back through the glass. There was nothing, only shadows moving in the streetlight. Still, the unease clung to him like damp air. He gathered the photographs and slipped them back into the envelope, his mind already turning over the next step. Part of him wanted to walk away. Another part knew it was already too late. If you followed this story to the end, then you understand, some mysteries refuse to stay buried. So ask yourself, if it were you, would you stop here or would you keep going? Let me know what you think, and if you want more stories like this, make sure you subscribe and stay with me, because the next chapter might be closer than you think.